Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we'll be discussing the difference between a block and an inline element. So here we have two different paragraphs. The first one says, I'm a paragraph. The second one says, I'm another paragraph with an emphasis tag in the middle of it. And if we go to the styles.css, all we are doing is taking the paragraphs and giving them a black border, and the emphasis tag is getting a blue border. And what you might notice when you look at the output is that the paragraph tag, regardless of how much text is actually in it, that border is taking up the entire width of the parent, so the entire width of the body. But why is that happening? Well, the reason for this is that the paragraph tag defaults to what we call a block level element. And block level elements do two things. One, they default to taking up the entire width of their parent, and two, they start on a new line. So regardless of how big these paragraphs are, they start on a new line. And we can actually test this by changing their width. So even though the width starts by being the entire width, we can change it and maybe do just 30 VW. And now the width gets much smaller and we could easily fit both of these paragraphs on one line, but they still end up going to a new line. The emphasis tag, on the other hand, is an inline element. And inline elements don't start on new lines and they only take up the width of their content. We can test this as well. So for example, I could set a width here of 100 VW and nothing is going to change. Why does nothing change? Well, because it's an inline element, it's just looking at the width of its content. It doesn't care what values you set here. The same thing is true for height. So I could set a height of 100 VH, which should be the entire height of the page. But again, this does absolutely nothing. That said, we actually can change the display property of an element if we ever need to. Most of the time you don't want to. All of the tags that contain just small pieces of text and content like emphasis and strong will usually all be inline elements by default, and that's what we want. And all of the larger containers tend to default to block, which is what we want for those. But if we ever do want to change it, we can do this with the display property. So if I make the emphasis tag displayed block and save it, you'll see now it is taking up 100 VW width and 100 VH height. And then if I were to get rid of this width and height and save it, you'll see the emphasis tag is now acting like the paragraphs. It's getting its own line. The only reason it's sort of squished up against the other ones is that the paragraph tag has some default margin, whereas the emphasis tag does not have any margin on it currently. But we could, of course, set some margin of, let's say, 10 pixels for a moment, and you'll see it now sort of splits itself up a little bit, but it is still inside of the paragraph that it was nested in inside of the HTML. So let's go ahead and get rid of this and look at the paragraphs one more time. What if we did want the paragraphs to be on the same line as each other? Well, I guess there's a few ways we could solve this. One, we could set a display of inline, and now we'll see they end up on the same line. But you'll notice this 30 VW isn't making any effect anymore, and that's because this is an inline element. Inline elements, like we said, can't have a width or a height. So setting the width and height no longer works. So what we can actually do here is add display inline block, and this is sort of a middle ground where it doesn't go to a new line, but you can still create custom widths and heights. So now we can see each of our paragraphs get this 30 VW width that we selected, as well as they are on the same line. There are plenty of other ways that we can get elements on the same lines, and we'll see more of that in future videos, but this is one of those ways, and we don't tend to use this a ton, but it can be nice to know that it exists. By default, the vast majority of the container style elements we've seen will be display block. The vast majority of the content, the small pieces of content like we saw with emphasis, will be display inline. And really the only tag we tend to see with inline block is images. And this is useful because images we oftentimes want to resize, but we usually don't want them taking up their own line. So inline block makes sense for those. Now that's all there is to display inline versus block. There are a few other values that we can pass to the display property, but for the most part, we tend to use inline and block, and these are the main defaults. We will, of course, see more of these display properties throughout the crash course, especially with CSS, Flexbox, and Grid. But for now, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you found it helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.